It's really great to be back here. We had 2 to 3 inches of snow in Spartanburg today, which means we shut the whole city down because we're not used to that kind of snowfall. So I woke up to a beautiful atmosphere here, and it's great to be back with the CMES. Thank you for having me. I want to make sure that I'm not trying to become a propaganda node for small liberal arts colleges. This is really about telling you what it's like so that you can decide if that's what you want. I think that's important. I think sometimes when you're on the job market, it's so stressful, and you might hear, I remember I would hear murmurs of apply to everything that moves, a common phrase. And I actually believe, after going through it myself, that's maybe not the best, because you want to know that you would want to take the jobs that you actually apply for. And so really what I want to do today is tell you what it's like to work at a small liberal arts college, so you can decide if that's a path you even want to go on, because you still have a lot of agency, right? And we sometimes forget that when we're trying to sell ourselves to different places. So I'll start with what it's like, and then if it's something you're like, yeah, I think I'd like to go down that path, or I'd be willing to try, then I'll try to share some tips. And I'd love it to be conversational, so feel free to stop me at any point, because I'm here to answer your questions. And just to kind of get started, I'd love to know who you are and what year you are and what program you're in, just so I get a feel for where people are in the room.
I'm Sean. I'm in the music program and first-year master's student.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria. I'm in rhetoric and composition, which is writing studies in the English department, and I'm in my 4th out of 5 years in the PhD, so I'll be on the market in the fall.
Hi everyone, my name is Kyla Kemp-Richard, and I am in my 4th year of my doctoral program of educational psychology, so I just began my dissertation.
Wow, great.
Hello, I'm Matthias Richard. I'm in the literature program here at the U of A. I'm in my first year of my PhD, finished my master's last year.
Hi, I'm Carrie Miller. I'm doing a dual PhD in anthropology and also Middle Eastern studies. And I am hoping that next year will be my last year. I finished my dissertation research and I'm working on the dissertation.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Miriam. I'm also a PhD student here in the department, 4th year. I'm from my research, and I'm sorry to try kind of a writing process.
Hi, I'm Zoe Kossoff. I'm also a PhD in MENAS. I just finished my NA in the fall, so it's my first year of PhD coursework.
Hi, my name is Malcolm. I am a PhD student in sociology. This is my 6th year, and I'm planning to go to job market next year, so I'm in my dissertation writing research process.
Great.
Hi, my name is Riyad. I'm a SLAC student, second language of teaching student. Hopefully I'll be attending by May. I'm graduating. I'm already in the process of applying for small and 3-4 classes colleges and universities. Hopefully something will work out.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Evan Kelman. I'm a 4th year PhD student in the biology department.
Okay, great. Okay. So I wanted to start off with some vocabulary, because just like when we start a PhD program, I know comprehensive exams, dissertation, these are loaded terms, and once we're in that system, we understand them. And there are loaded terms in the SLAC world, even SLAC. Right, before I went to Wofford, I didn't really, if you would have said SLAC to me, I'd be like, what? Small liberal arts college. So I wanted to go over just a few of those terms, and these might be things you would hear bandied about maybe if you have an on-campus interview, or terms that you might want to put into questions if you have like a Skype interview at a small liberal arts college, because I think sometimes knowing that people know that language is a good first impression, right? They know you kind of understand their world a little bit. And people forget, that these are terms not everyone knows. So started with SLAC, Small Liberal Arts College. PUI is a term that refers to primarily undergraduate institutions, so they're only teaching undergraduates, just like a SLAC. SOTL stands for Scholarship on Teaching and Learning. So many of us are, when we're in our PhD programs, we're steeped in our discipline, we're steeped in our methodologies, we're working with professors at R1 institutions, right? Research 1 institutions. They're researching in their field. Just like when you heard the title of my dissertation, right? It's very much field specific. Whereas at small liberal arts colleges, you're usually asked to be a generalist. So, you know, maybe I was on the Turkish studies track here at U of A. Now I'm coordinating a Middle East and North African program, right? And that can be the politics, the history, the language. So you're asked to do many things, and sometimes you don't have the money to go back into the field or to do that very extremely nuanced research you did as a PhD student. So a lot of us at small liberal arts colleges, we still continue research, but we make our classrooms our laboratory. And we start producing research about pedagogy, about teaching. So that's what SOTL is. TT, tenure track. So some jobs might be postdocs, some might be visiting, and then some would be the tenure track. Gen Ed refers to those general education classes that many undergraduates take. And small liberal arts colleges usually have an intense 2-year process where students aren't asked to declare a major or minor, and they're taking a lot of these general education classes. And they're also sometimes referred to as service classes. So you're doing service to the college, and many applicants at a SLAC would be asked to come up with courses that could fit that service, right? So one of my general education classes is for all freshmen called Humanities 101. And my topic is exploring the Middle East. Right? So that's kind of a general opening into that world, but you might have a class on methodology. So another general ed class that I teach in the religion department is on ethnography. So you might want to think about, okay, what are my skills and how could I translate this into maybe a more general audience, especially if they don't have a MENA program, right? Or they don't have whatever your specific discipline is. For those gen ed classes. And then they talk about lower level classes, the 100, 200 levels, and upper level classes, so 300, 400. Since you don't have graduate students, you're not going to have many of the 400 levels, but 300 is also considered upper level in that world. Another term you hear bandied about is high impact practices. So this is a way of teaching that really motivates people to get very engaged with the student. Where I would say my high impact practices is when I teach a capstone course. For our students in the MENA program, it's usually their junior or senior year, and they take a class devoted to writing a 20 to 25 page thesis. And for an undergrad, that's pretty heavy, so it takes a lot of time on your part usually to do these types of high impact practices. And that's something that a SLAC might want to hear about if you're in a job interview. Teaching load, this is referred to how many courses is that school going to contractually have you teach each year. So you'll see sometimes 5-5, 4-4, 3-1-3. What does that mean? Well, 5-5 would mean each semester you're asked to do 5 courses. That would be considered pretty heavy, and there are some small liberal arts colleges and I would say smaller, maybe regional state schools that do have that load. 4-4 is pretty common, I would say, these days. 3-3 is considered good. That's a healthy balance.
Are those repeat, so you do 2 sections of the same one?
That's a great, so how many preps would be in there? I know a colleague at a regional state school in Georgia. It's a 4-4 and each class is an individual prep. So that's 4 preps, maybe 8 a year, right? So if you are teaching now, I know that sometimes it feels like a lot when you're a grad student. That's actually a huge benefit for this market because you already have classes prepped. And you can go to that interview with saying, these are the courses I've already been an instructor on record. And that's where you become a little more competitive, honestly, than schools that maybe have funding packages that don't require teaching because they want to make sure people can hit the ground running and teach these heavier preps. At Wofford, it is a 3-1-3, so that means there's 3 courses in the fall, 3 in the spring, and we have shortened semesters so that we have this little unique course every January for about 1 month, and that's that one in the middle. It's kind of like a Maymester. It's called interim, January term at other schools, and usually these are more creative classes. So at Wofford they say pick anything you desire, and actually you don't have to be an expert in that field. You can learn with your students. So what I end up doing is I co-teach a course about the stories of Spartanburg, kind of bringing in a little bit of that ethnographic method, but instead of an intellectual piece or some sort of research piece, they're doing Humans of New York style interviews with people around the city and then posting it on a Facebook group. So a lot of SLAC schools kind of want you to have these kind of outside of the box ideas for courses that are termed Jan term or interim. Student-professor ratio, this is really the average across campus. It doesn't mean every class will only have 11 students to one professor, but they kind of average it out how many is average. And at Wofford, the cap, which is the next term, the max students allowed in one class is 25. That's considered a large class. And I know if you're used to teaching maybe large lecture halls, this is where that high impact practice comes in. If you're doing a lot of writing intensive work with your students, to have 25 is actually, it feels like quite a bit. You know, you're kind of moving away from, it's pretty uncommon to see Scantron test, I think, at a lot of SLAC institutions. You wouldn't have multiple choice tests, so you're doing a lot of essay writing, you're doing a lot of hands-on work with your students, so 25, that's even considered pretty large. That's for a general education course, and all of our upper level courses where they're even more engaged with the students and topic, those are capped in my department at about 15 to 18. Okay. Any questions there, or terms you may have heard that you want clarification on? Okay. Yeah.
Silly question. Do you have teaching assistants?
No,
No grad students?
that's a great question. Yeah, so there's no grad students that you teach, and then there's also no grad students to be there funded to help professors. So you don't have research assistants, right? So all your research is on your own. You wouldn't have any type of TA, teaching assistant, to help you grade. So all of that is left for you. I think at Wofford we can have an undergraduate teaching assistant, but really you're kind of wanting them to get more involved in maybe helping the students with projects, mentoring the students. You wouldn't say, can you grade 25 essays? That would probably be frowned upon. So yeah, that is not really at your disposal. Good question. Small liberal arts colleges, they typically range 4,000 or less students. Wofford is all undergraduates, and we have 1,500 students. Okay. And there we go. There are usually very few, if any, graduate programs. Wofford doesn't have any. In our city, we have a women's college, Converse College, that's predominantly primarily undergraduate institution, but they have expanded to have a MA in education and an MFA. So you'll have some small liberal arts colleges that might expand a little bit, but still their primary focus is undergraduates. They often emphasize the whole student, right? And they'll talk a lot about non-curricular activities. So students being involved in clubs, in athletics. Oftentimes you're also kind of asked by students, hey, would you be the faculty advisor of this initiative? I'm the faculty advisor of the Muslim Student Association, and a faculty advisor of another students to students group. So that's something common at SLACs. That's where some of your service comes into play. Mm-hmm.
So previously you mentioned research a few times. Are you still expected to do research and publish even SLAC content?
This can vary widely between which SLAC that you're applying to, and that's something you kind of want to try to get at when you look at their website. And I'll tell you some words that might kind of trigger that you would be expected to do a little more research. If they use the term scholar teacher, that's kind of a designated term that SLAC will have some research expectations. Swarthmore, Oberlin, Wake Forest, These are all institutions that are clearly in the scholar-teacher mode, and they also have slightly reduced teaching loads. Like at Wake Forest, I believe it's a 3-2 semester. So you do 3 courses one semester, 2 courses another semester, and that's considered very good for a SLAC. Wofford, we're trying to move ourselves in that direction, so now the administration started using the term scholar-teacher. But this is not where you're usually not expected to publish in certain journals. It wouldn't be the same expectations as research at a Research 1. So at Wofford, though we're moving in that direction, they're very open to boutique journals. For example, this talk will go in my tenure and promotion portfolio. My research now, I often publish on pedagogy. So about teaching Islamic studies post 9/11 was a recent article that I worked on and published in a teaching and learning journal through Wabash Center. So I would say the research is usually more open-ended. Only the very top, most competitive SLACs would ever probably say you need a book, right? You need to publish a manuscript for tenure and promotion, right? That's not expected usually at a SLAC. But those are great questions. If you get an interview at a SLAC, you kind of want to ask them, so what are your research expectations? It wouldn't maybe be my first question, but after kind of learning more about the institution, I think that's really something that you can be open about. So what would be the expectations, if any, at this institution?
So even it's not, it's still expected even it's not clearly mentioned in the ad itself.
Right, now if they put in the ad scholar teacher, that's kind of telling you, okay, they want you to still focus on your scholarship. And a lot of times, tenure and promotion, if you dig around on their website, you can try to find out kind of what do they expect. And that's definitely a good question to ask if you're at the interview stage, right? So you kind of have to find out from school to school, but I know very few that would have the same expectations as a Research 1, because they also know you don't have the same time. Like at most SLACs, you don't have a pre-tenure sabbatical, right? So you're not getting time before you go up to tenure to maybe go back out and to do research and do field work, or to have extensive time working on transforming your dissertation into a publishable book. At Wofford, my colleagues that have gone about, doesn't mean that everyone stops their research, it just takes longer. So a colleague has put out his second book, and his first book took 5 years before he was able to get everything he needed done with basically his dissertation work to get it published. So it wouldn't be the same turnaround that you would expect at a Research 1, because you'd want that in contract, right? If you're at a Research 1, that might be actually part of the requirements for you to earn tenure there. That's usually not the case at a SLAC. Okay, and if it were, you'd want to make sure maybe they do have a novel pre-tenure sabbatical that you could ask them about, and you'd want to ask them, well, how do you support that kind of research requirement? But most are very honest that teaching is your main focus, and so your main evaluative branch of teaching research service would be teaching when you go up for tenure. Okay. And oftentimes you'll hear the reverse actually in a SLAC committee for a job, where if you have a candidate that starts with their research and is really passionate about their research, that committee might say, well, I don't know if this is really the best fit, because we don't have those types of resources to support that person. And honestly, that can be what separates some candidates, right? Because they also don't want to have someone come that's not really happy to do the teaching.
So, my name is Kayla. So part of what I like to think about with research and all the different roles as graduate students present me is to merge my roles into one. So I like to do a lot of research with my undergraduates in the schools that we work with. Would that still be seen as, I don't know, maybe too much, since it's also merging research with the teaching aspect?
Well, one aspect is they kind of want to know how would you continue any type of scholarship work. And so that would be a novel way to say, well, I actually already use my classroom as a laboratory. And I know I won't have the same numbers that I might have. They won't be data sets with 300 students, but if you can still get IRB, Institutional Review Board, and have your students as your participants, that would be a novel way to say this is how I want to continue my research, right? And we had a colleague who was from the sciences from U of A who was hired in our biology department actually, and he had access to very high-tech laboratory equipment here at U of A that he was not going to have at a SLAC. And so he said that was something he had to talk about. Like how can he still do research, but how can he communicate that he understands his resources will be quite different. So he started looking at other aspects of his discipline and kind of moved away from research that would require that those high-tech and expensive startup costs. That's one thing, usually SLACs, if you have a lab, they are not going to give you large startup resources. Okay. Good question. Any other questions for this slide? A couple more points, just classes like I talked about, this engaged pedagogy where you're emphasizing writing, critical thinking, speaking skills. One aspect I hear a lot of my colleagues talk about, and I've kind of moved in this direction, is teaching in what's referred to as a flipped classroom. So is that a term you guys know, like where you're asking the student to actually go up and maybe they're going to present a lecture and they're going to be the experts on that day's reading. Is there any other ideas with this term flipped classroom that you guys either utilize now or you've heard about?
Not utilize, but blending from these.
Yeah, so just probably saying you're going to just do PowerPoint lectures would not be exciting for that selection committee. So you want to try to show in your teaching demonstration that you're emphasizing these engaged practices. And this is where I would recommend kind of reading up on current trends in pedagogy across any discipline really. And I have a few resources at the end that have helped me with that kind of teaching style. Okay, so just thinking about the pros and the cons of working at a SLAC. So relatively small achievements in research, So with teaching the pros, teaching is valued and you have lots of support. So we have a Center for Innovative Learning. We have a lot of grant money in the summer or throughout the semester where they encourage us to go to pedagogy conferences and they want us to have conversations amongst other faculty members about how we're teaching and what we're teaching. So we also have a faculty dining room, and a lot of times the conversation there is around pedagogy. So you have lots of support with that. The con to that would be the pressure for that engaged teaching. It takes a lot of time. It's really a lot of time to prep courses, right? To make sure you feel like every lecture, because sometimes it feels like a huge performance, right? Especially if you have a semester where you might be prepping more than one new course. Yeah.
And how do they assess that? Is it through student evaluations, or do people come and observe your classes?
So at Wofford, we always have evaluations at the end of a course for untenured faculty, and now they did review and start changing their tenure and promotion requirements, and they now have a system where every new faculty member needs to have a mentor professor come in and review one of their days in class. They're trying to be very inclusive and supportive. They let you pick who you want to come in, so it's really, they use terminology like trying to help you, trying to make sure we're using the best practices, and maybe that professor might learn something from you. So it's not supposed to feel too onerous, but yeah, they're really wanting to see what is your dynamic in the classroom. I know for me, the teaching demo is probably one of the most important aspects of that interview, right? They really want to know what you're like in the classroom. A lot of times at Wofford, they have faculty talk series. And if you go to, for example, your disciplinary conference, you might go and people will sometimes read their paper. That would not be something you'd ever want to do at a presentation at a SLAC. They would want you to, even in presenting your own research, they kind of view that as, well, that's what this person's like in the classroom. So you have to think about, even when you do your research presentation, because some SLACs will still have you do a teaching demo and a research presentation, don't be fooled. Actually, the research presentation is still them wanting to assess how you work in groups. So don't just read a research paper. They still want to see, are you interacting with the audience? Are you able to relate your research topic to non-experts, right? Because unlike at a large school where you can really get graduate students in a class that really understand maybe Ottoman history, or they understand urban renewal projects, you're working with undergrads who you have to unpack that entire term, maybe the entire semester. So be conscious of that when you present your research, and make it so that any faculty member, any undergrad that might come and be invited to the talk would understand. Small classes. This can be great, but it is a lot of grading because you don't have those graduate assistants, and they typically are longer writing pieces. And the students come to expect a lot of feedback, right? And I will tell you, my requirements for office hours, I think for some professors, especially in the non-SLAC world, they are shocked when I tell them, I'm really expected to have an hour of office hours each day of the week. Yeah.
Per class?
No, it can be just across the board, and then some professors have even more than that, but that's kind of the minimum. And at Wofford, they do like you to break up your classes through the whole week. So I remember that was something I learned very quickly. I mentioned to someone, oh, I'd love to teach a Tuesday, Thursday load. Oh, well, we don't actually do that here. We split them up so that you have more time to do your classes throughout the week. You have more time to be engaged with the student. So this idea that you might be able to just come into the office and teach, and you have all your teaching on 2 days of the week, would kind of be frowned upon at a lot of SLAC. So you want to keep that in mind. And that might be something that you're like, okay, no, my research is really important. My own flexibility is really important. I don't think I'd want that for my life, right? And that's I think a big thing to think about with these types of schools. So you also get opportunities to kind of teach outside of your field. This interim class, at first I was really overwhelmed, like, oh, I was trained in this way, and I feel like, what am I going to do? And the first time I taught it, it took about two interims, and the students would actually tell me, okay, this isn't what interim's like, maybe let's change it. And so with their feedback, they helped me out. But I really enjoy it now because I've realized, okay, once I have the courses prepped, that's really where I can get very creative, right? If I want to learn how to do Mediterranean cooking, I could create a class on Mediterranean cooking, and that's what we do for the month. A lot of faculty go on study abroad trips with their students during that month. So you can get very creative. When I was hired at Wofford, I was hired to teach a class on world religions. And at first I even questioned applying for that position because I thought, I don't know, that seems really outside of my expertise. And then I realized, well, that's kind of what they're asking you to do. So you understand that you'll be pushed in places where you probably would feel like, wait, I don't feel like that's really my expertise. But that adds to the prep time, right? You have to take more time prepping that class. But if you think about it, this might be an undergrad taking one religion class their entire career at Wofford, and they just want to know about the big five, right? We're going to learn a little about the Abrahamic religions, and then we threw in Buddhism and Hinduism. So that was a hurdle at first for me, but I've realized all of my colleagues are put in that position. And that's where imposter syndrome can come into play a little bit. But you just have to be confident that they want you for this job and they value your skill set. They just want to push you because they need to have a breadth instead of a real depth for these undergraduates. And the con to this is you're not really going to have a lot of opportunities to teach very specific content, right? So if you're really wanting to teach exactly what you did your dissertation on, and you were hoping to have a classroom of discussion on that specific, nuanced, narrow topic, that just might not make at a SLAC school, right? So those opportunities are fewer and far in between. You might have a section, you could have a section of an overall Middle East and North African class on urban renewal projects in Turkey, but I'm not going to create a class on that, right? It's just not going to fit my context. Okay, so research, though not maybe the thing you're focusing the most on, it still is there. And because of that, the nice thing about that is relatively small achievements are celebrated, right? So I will tell you, a lot of the scholarship I'm doing now wouldn't be very respected, or even, it probably wouldn't even count at a Research 1 institution. So the book that I'm publishing is an edited volume, where I've edited the volume and I've used networking skills to get different professors at small liberal arts colleges around the country to contribute to the volume. I've contributed a chapter, but it's not my manuscript, right? And it's on the scholarship of teaching and learning. It's all about teaching Islamic studies. So Wofford's very proud of this. They're very happy I'm doing it. It's coming out with Indiana University Press, so it's a peer-reviewed publication, but I will tell you, I'm sure if I was at a Research 1 institution, this probably wouldn't even count for tenure, right? And since that is my passion, that would actually be a downside for me, because I wouldn't feel like the things I want to focus on would be respected at certain research institutions. So when I get published in pedagogy journals, they put that up at faculty meetings, right? So you feel like you're really celebrated if you're trying to do research, right? Because they kind of consider that going above and beyond, since they know you're really focused on teaching and service. So there's very little pressure to ever get outside grants. Now, because Wofford is moving into that scholar-teacher area, they have hired a grants officer, and she has helped us get some really nice grants, but it never felt like, if you don't get this grant, you're not going to get tenured, right? So that's been nice. There's actually no pressure to do that. And I guess in the sciences, your job is also not. It's not like you have to find funding to fund your position, right? It's already built into the budget. So engage talented undergrads. I will say with the MENA program, that is true. The program is above and beyond a major or minor, and they have to do a 20 to 25 page paper on top of maybe the thesis paper they have to do in their own discipline. So these are pretty stellar students that decide to work on that kind of project, and I've had a lot of fun working with them. So in that way, sometimes you can kind of have a relationship with some of your students if you're writing a big thesis, like maybe your professors here might have with a master's student. But I will tell you, not all students, like in my general education classes, I can't assume they're all going to be so excited about the Middle East and North Africa. That's when it's like, oh, I had to take a class in the religion department. I got in yours because it had some seats filled. So I also have to work with that, knowing there are people that this is a gen ed, it's a requirement. How can I make that interesting and exciting for them, even if it's not something. Usually in my ethnography class, I ask on the first day, who knows what ethnography means? No one raises their hand. So we're starting at that level, and I have to push to get them to know about the method and appreciate the method. Some cons, well, the resources vary widely. You're not going to have that pre-tenure sabbatical. You don't have as many startup costs being paid by the university for your research. They might not have grants at some schools to help you at all in the summer. I know at Wofford they do, but I will say they're limited funds, so it's not like every summer you can rely on that. You know that, okay, I've had one this year, I might have to set out for a few years and then try again. So these are things to think about. You have small participant pools if you are doing research and relying on your students. We don't have those graduate students to help with your research. You also have a few campus collaborators. So for example, I have affiliated faculty that teach a REACH course, kind of they're going a little bit outside their discipline to add maybe a Middle East history course or an Islamic art course. They didn't study that specifically. And they're great to talk to, but it's not like I'm at a MESA conference and I'm talking to other Turkish studies scholars or other scholars that their whole PhD dissertation had to do with this area of the world. So sometimes you might feel a little bit isolated in that regard. And you might not find people at your institution to co-author with. That's something you probably need to continue to go to your national conferences. I love going to MESA for that reason, because then I can interact with people kind of in that world, but I'm not going to have those interactions with my colleagues at Wofford. And of course, because they don't have the same support model for research, the progress is very slow. Service is another prong, and it's important at SLACs. So service can be being on a committee at the school. So I'm on a cultural affairs committee where we give out grants for cultural affair type initiatives on campus. You might be asked to be on a committee about curriculum decisions, general education committees. You might also join a committee that's geared towards undergraduates, like the committee I'm on at MESA. It's for undergraduate Middle East studies, right? So that's something that SLAC would be really excited about. And actually they say that once you're tenured at SLACs, you're usually asked to be on even more committees, and your service load gets larger. And you might get on committees that are more time intensive. So actually service usually increases after tenure at a SLAC. You can have an opportunity to think beyond higher education. In your field, you might be asked, what's common in my town, Spartanburg, you'll have local churches that want to have a scholar. Could you please come to my church and talk about Islam? Can you please come to this event at the library and talk about Middle East studies, right? So a lot of times the community you're in, it's quite small, and they want to use your skill set for a more general audience. And you have to decide, is that something that you want to do? I mean, because this can be a really contentious political topic, especially depending on what audience you have come to these events, I typically will do maybe one a year, but then I limit myself, right? Because you could be asked to do too much, and you don't want to be overstretched, and you still want to kind of protect yourself. Your main goal is putting time in to prep your classes and teach the students you're being paid to teach, and it's okay to do these service obligations, but I can say I've seen this could go out of hand, this could get out of hand, so you kind of have to think about how many would you want to do, what are the expectations you might have. Do you have a small honorarium fee, just to say, well, I do these, but I do have a $100 honorarium fee, especially if you're driving somewhere, you're using your own gas. I think you can kind of think through, okay, what parameters do I want to put around this? Okay. The cons. There's a lot of campus-wide politics. Like, I think at larger schools, you get very embedded and interested in the politics of your department. At SLACs, like at Wofford, we have every month a faculty-wide meeting. 150. So, and this is where we vote on courses. So your course doesn't just go up to your department for approval. The entire faculty sees your course and decides, does this fit this model? And they get very specific, right? Because this is their passion, and so they want to make sure, is the 200 level, are the expectations really a 200 level? Is the so they're going to be quite critical, and they're wanting to make sure this works for all students across campus. So you have to kind of open yourself up to that kind of critique and kind of getting to know all the faculty, even beyond your department. And there are definitely political minefields that you might not know about. So I always say the first year we had a new president, and he said the first year he was just going to listen. I thought that was a really great tactic. Like, just kind of take that ethnographer stance and just listen to your colleagues and try to get to know different things. I know I've stepped on toes. I didn't even know there were toes there. I didn't know that this one thing, this maybe one class, somebody across campus has been teaching it, and I didn't know that because maybe it was a reach course for them, or you're using the same book as someone and they had, they've been using that book for 15 years. So these are the type of things that you just kind of have to know that they're going to happen and be open to saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, and thank you for letting me know. Let me kind of look into my skill set and see what book I could put on my syllabus, or maybe we could collaborate and co-teach something in the future. But those colleagues are going to be the colleagues that are on committees to decide whether you're tenured or not. So it's not just your department that you want to try to get along with, it is kind of that overall community. It can be hard to disengage. A lot of times these are small communities. I was interviewed at a small liberal arts college with 1,000 students. The population of the town in Wisconsin was 2,000. And there was a neighborhood right by the school, and all the professors lived in that neighborhood, right? And it made sense. It was April and there was a lot of snow on the ground, and so you're like, okay, if I'm gonna have to put my snow pants on to walk to campus because I can't get my car out of the driveway, it makes sense why they're living so close. There may not be a lot of apartments other places. You kind of have to decide how you're gonna deal with that, right? At Wofford, there are some nice little communities about a half hour away, and some professors have decided, I want to live in that community. I want to live in Greenville. It's about double the size of Spartanburg, and then I'm going to commute in. But I will say some SLACs kind of, the unwritten rule is you're going to live in that community and you're going to be a part of that community. So that's something you kind of want to try to get the feel for, maybe by asking, so where do most of the faculty live? They might tell you, oh, everybody lives in this neighborhood, or everyone lives in this town. Or if they start naming other towns, okay, it's open to having a life outside of the city limits. And again, we were talking about being a team player across campus. Work-life balance. The good news is it is, I think, pretty easy to carve out a 9-to-5 schedule. At Wofford, it's very rare to see people stay in their office really after 4:30. Very little travel, so you're not expected to go to multiple conferences a year or have tons of invited talks. Like if this was my only invited talk in my whole career at Wofford, it's okay. So that can be a plus. As far as your work obligations. But the student expectations are quite high, and I did learn this from experience. I will never give out my cell phone to any of my students because of that, that expectation of being super engaged. It didn't work, okay? But I was having a conversation. I actually will friend my students on Facebook because one of my classes is so Facebook heavy, but once I made that decision, I had to change the way I used Facebook, right? So that's something to think about. Either have a policy, I'm not gonna friend any student. Now I don't friend them, but if they ask to friend me, I have decided I will friend them. And I actually enjoy it because I like, once they've graduated, I like seeing where they've gone. A lot of times our alum will come back for alumni weekend, and they'll contact me through Facebook. So I've found it helpful, but I know if you're very personal on Facebook, you might just want to have a policy, that's my personal space, and I don't want to have students. And you can just tell them, I'm sorry, I have a policy where I don't friend my students. And you are expected to be engaged on campus. I remember I got really paranoid actually about this issue when I first was at Wofford. I went to a football game and I noticed that you had to sign in. And I thought, oh, is someone looking at this and analyzing who's coming to these games? No, you get free tickets, so it was more about that. And I learned, I'm not really into athletics, so I don't go to the games anymore. That's not what I like to do. I might go to a theater production one semester. I have a little 6.5-month-old, so it's hard for me to go to those things now. And I've learned, well, the expectations aren't so high, but there might be a speaker that comes, and I want to go to that. But it can become your whole life if you let it. And that's one thing I think at a small liberal arts school, you want to put boundaries on that as well. I'll be honest, most of my friends do come from the faculty at Wofford. I'm only now able to say, oh, I have a few non-Wofford friends, and I've been in this community for 5 years. So I think that's something also to think about with these kind of small town environments. And some people that's not what they want, right? So if this all sounds at all appealing, some things I would suggest to do if you are going to target small liberal arts colleges is, this is really big. I've been on 2 selection committees now, and you have to tailor that letter to that school. I would really recommend, this is why I'm like, don't apply if you don't really think you would accept that job, because you really have to put in the time for that letter. Read the mission statement. Go deep into the department, looking at CVs and looking at different course descriptions your colleagues might have, trying to understand where the college is, if they're scholar teacher or not scholar teacher, if they have an interim type course, knowing that they have that, what's that like, what would you want to teach if you were asked to teach outside your discipline in this creative way. We're looking for that when we just analyze the letters, right? And I think maybe in markets where, it used to be that I think it would be hard to attract certain scholars to a small liberal arts college. And I will say now that the market has tightened, the employer has a lot of say in who they hire. And so what I've noticed just in these 2 selection committees, they're able to find at least a healthy group of people that it's very clear they want to be at a small liberal arts college. And then those are the people that get invited to campus. So that's why I say, if it's not something you want to do, you don't want to waste your time. You don't want to just take what you're using for a Research 1 school and just change the names, because if you lead with your research, you're not going to be considered beyond that initial letter. And you can talk about, I personally didn't go to a small liberal arts college. I think it's great if you do have that experience and you can talk about that in your letter, but I didn't. But I had an experience where I went to Wake Forest for a conference, and I talked about that experience. One suggestion is, if you want to apply to like a community college or a SLAC and you don't have experience there, maybe shadow someone at Pima Community College. And then you can talk about what that experience was like in a letter to a community college. And they're like, okay, you at least know what this is about. Because that would be a totally different world than a SLAC. Or if you could go to a SLAC institution, maybe in your hometown or close by here, and just say, I kind of want to spend a day shadowing, you could talk about that in your letter. Just they want to know that you at least know that there's going to be these big differences. And maybe why you're choosing them, right? And talk about how you might be able to conduct your research. We kind of talked about that. Either going to the scholarship on teaching and learning, or making sure you're saying, well, I used these different instruments in my lab previously, but I can do this other project now that I've been really passionate about. We had a physics professor who came to Wofford saying, I always have wanted to write a book for children communicating physics to a young audience. And she had positions at other places that weren't SLAC, and that was something they were really not willing to let her spend her time on. And then she says, that's really my passion, and she was able to do that at Wofford, and she's applauded. And she actually worked with students. She got grant money, and she had artistics. She worked with a faculty in the art department, a faculty in the English department, and they all kind of collaborated then with a physics student, English student, art student, and they all kind of created this children's book, and now they're working on publishing it. So those are the kind of things, it's like, okay, yeah, you're not going to get funding to do that at R1s, but Wofford would applaud that and be really excited to have you do that. Scholarship with undergrads, if you can talk about that, that's really exciting for SLACs, right? Because they are all about the student experience, so how can you maybe do some research where you're training a student to do that research alongside you? Be sure that you can teach say that you can teach the class in the job ad, right? It's great if you have a mock syllabus that you could, if they don't ask for the syllabus, I don't recommend putting anything additional into those initial packets because the selection committee won't look at them. But if you get invited to campus, by all means, hey, I just wanted to show you this is kind of the syllabus I'm working on, even if you've never taught the class. And if you have taught the class or a similar class, even better, you can talk about, this was my experience teaching at University of Arizona, And if you can, try to connect to the location, because at small places, the biggest fear for a selection committee is really that you would get there and not want to stay. Because a lot of times we don't have a lot of money to do tons of searches. It's not like, okay, if you don't publish in these 6 journals by year 3, you should move on because you're not going to get to stay. No, they're really investing that and hoping you'll stay for your entire career. So the worst situation for a selection committee would be that they hire someone that really didn't want to be there and then leaves. And I think that's difficult to do in general. I will tell you, after visiting at Wofford for 2 years, I was a visiting instructor. The only job interviews and campus interviews I had, campus interviews were only small liberal arts colleges. So be careful too that first position kind of locks you in a way into that path a little bit. So unless you're what they term publishing out of, like unless you were able to get somehow in the summer, you found the time to publish your dissertation, and then you would be in the running with other R1 candidates, you're kind of gaining the experience of the SLAC world, so then you're more attractive to other SLAC schools. So I think that's important to think about. You don't want to say, well, I'll take this job, it's tenure track, but I don't ever intend to stay. I think that hurts you for your other job prospects, and it also hurts the institution. So don't use the same material as you would use in your research-oriented jobs. Don't write your research statement that someone outside of your field wouldn't be able to understand. Don't forget to mention that you can teach intro courses, method theories courses, first-year seminars, those service courses that we talked about, general education courses. And then I just wanted to share with you, these have been really critically important for me in trying to better understand the SLAC world. Like I said, I only went to large state institutions other than that one conference at Wake Forest. So I had a large learning curve, I feel like, in the first couple of years at Wofford. And now someone showed me this Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning. Even though it's geared towards theology and religion, they have a lot of overarching lessons about pedagogy, and they have a really great blog that scholars from small liberal arts colleges are blogging about pedagogy. So I included that link. And then the Association of American Colleges and Universities, AAC&U, they have a large national conference. You could go to that. But you could also kind of just look. There's 2 specific sites that I thought were most helpful for small liberal arts candidates, and that's their section on high impact practices, so you could get a feel of what are some of those ideas you could do and add in the classroom, and then student success, because student success initiatives are a big buzzword at SLAC schools right now. Any questions? Yeah.